her book on the bear family.
Okay, thank you. I have to apologize before I start because I got my notes, I managed to get my notes all mixed up and in a big pile. It's not easy to do such a calamitous thing. So I'm going to be winging it most of the evening, but I have backup. I have Paul is here tonight. And I thought he sat down. Is that in the shadows?
Right here.
There you are. Anyway, I can depend on him to fill me in or correct me if I get things wrong. The Ringling influence started back when the circus came to town. The circus did not ordinarily come to Montana because we didn't have enough people. There weren't enough people to come to make it profitable. However, if they were crossing Montana, going to Washington or back or whatever, they always had to stop and water the animals and feed them anyway. So if they had to stop for that reason, they scheduled a circus. The circus that we want to start with was the one that, my mind is gone here. I might have to get I do apologize. I'm not usually so, whoops. I'm not usually this discombobulated, but I find that I'm not getting any younger. So, John Ringling was the person who scheduled these stops. He traveled around the country before the circus ever stopped, so that everything was just cut and dried because they had 4 sections of the train, or 4 trains, and in order to have a clear track for them and for the other people, why they had to be right on a schedule. And I think Paul can tell you about scheduling circuses. He traveled with them later than this. But at any rate, Lewis Penwell was a promoter from Helena. He was boosting Montana and trying to get people to come and invest and and live here. And he was after Ringling to make some purchases in Montana. So in 1903, John Ringling bought the Catlin Ranch in Marr County. And then he started looking around, and there were hot springs at White Sulphur Springs. So people were wanting to promote this and make it into a spa, or, a resort type of thing. And so they asked him to look at that too. And after he bought the Catlin property, he set up in 1903, he set up a office in White Sulphur and had Paul, what was his?
Want me to come up there and help you out, Lee?
I think so. At any rate, he
Folks, several of the guys in the book. So you're not talking to a boy.
he established his office with, was it Calkins?
Calkins, yes.
Calkins.
Ralph Calkins.
Right. And he was with him for as long as I have found out. I mean, I haven't seen where he ever terminated his job with with Ringling. Then Ringling and another man bought a bunch of property in 1907 and formed a agricultural business. They were selling plots of land, and they also sold. They would, in order to entice people to come and invest in this Montana land, they they offered all of these advantages. They would help you with building. They would help you with the plowing, and John Ringling brought in some very impressive machinery for the day and age, the very latest. That particular company did pretty well, I think.
Yes.
And then about 1916, John Ringling looked at the war in Europe and thought that when the war was over, there would be a market for dairy cattle and other stock that people would need to restock. And so he started a dairy in 16. So he was pretty well involved, and of course, they kept wanting a railroad. The Jawbone, which was the name for the railroad that it came into, it went from Helena to Castle, and Castle had all this wonderful ore to ship out, and the railroad was called the Jawbone because it was built on jawbone more than actual money. But anyway, they got into Castle just about in time for Castle to fail, and so they didn't need a railroad into Castle. So they terminated the extension up to Castle and went on down the road to Harlowtown. It was Merino at that point, in order to save the investment. Now, these were on the south fork of the Muscle Shell, and White Sulphur Springs was on the north fork of the Muscle Shell, so they weren't getting into this transportation boom.
Can I interrupt you, Lee?
Mm-hmm.
White Sulphur Springs is on the north fork of Smith River.
Smith River, what did I say?
Smith River runs north to Great Falls.
Oh.
The Muscle Shell goes down through Martinsdale and that one.
Okay. Thank you.
White Sulphur, my old hometown is White Sulphur Springs. I rode horseback all over that country.
Yeah.
But it's Smith River at White Sulphur Springs.
Yeah. Well, at any rate, they had hot springs at White Sulphur, and the people that lived there wanted somebody to come in, like John Ringling, and promote that and build it up into a tourist attraction or a health attraction, whatever. And so then then as I said, they wanted a railroad, and the nearest thing they could think of doing would be to take a 10-mile extension over to the Jawbone. So they talked to John Ringling, can you do this for us? And so he said he would build a railroad if they would give him a little assist, and they managed to gather up $50,000 to finance this railroad. And then he went in partnership with the Milwaukee, and the little spur was put in. There was one fellow in the town who was a real crab. I mean, he didn't like anything. He didn't like. He and his family ran a store and freighting business, I think, and they said, "Oh, John Ringling was just a thief. He took that money, and it didn't cost him that much to build the railroad, but he got the rest of it." Well, actually, that's probably true, but that doesn't mean that he didn't get the job done for them. And so the little spur from White Sulphur over to Ringling, and Ringling actually was not, it was Leader, and they they got the spur over that far, and so that they could use the Milwaukee. That was another thing that sort of got my interest, was came out in the newspaper that that some people were agitating for Ringling to change its name back to Leader, because the thought of Ringling brought up terrible images of animals being not taken care of or anything. And there was this rumor, this persistent rumor, and it exists even today, I ran into it a year ago, that the Ringling Circus people were going to make Ringling a winter, or a what do you call it when you put them into the off-season?
Oh, in the winter quarters?
Winter quarters, okay. Can you see winter quarters in Ringling, Montana? But anyway, and as I say, this thing persists even today, this idea that was going to happen. And then another little incidental thing that was of interest that I came across, F. Scott Fitzgerald was in White Sulphur during that time, and he was a schoolmate of Walter Donahoe, who was one of the farmer or rancher's sons in White Sulphur. And he came out to spend the summer with his schoolmate, and he worked on the ranch, and he wrote a short story later about the caves that were there. Have you ever been in those caves?
The caves?
Uh-huh.
Yes.
I never have. I wonder how I get in. Anyway, that was just a little item that I thought was interesting that I ran across. Okay, now we've got the railroad over, and then the good folks wanted John Ringling or someone to develop the spa so that it would be a place for people to come and take the waters and spend money and that sort of thing. And things got a little busy for John, and once again, he said if they wanted to help support it, he would do it. But it never got done. And so the springs are still there. You drive over them when you drive up the main street of White Sulphur, but if you go into the motel, you can have a bath in their hot springs. Then, now's where I missed my outline. But I guess we can just go down the family here. The next Ringling to come to Montana was Paul's father, Richard. And his father had made up a circus, what they call a trunk circus. Anyway, they didn't get on it. They weren't on the railroads at that time. This little one wasn't. And after he decided he didn't like that either, so he came out to Montana, and he liked it and wanted to stay. And he married one of the local girls, Aubrey Black. I had
My mother was born in 1894 at White Sulphur Springs. And her uncle was Leslie, that was next to the last territorial governor. L-E-S-L-I-E, Leslie. Not E-Y, but I-E. But I think he was governor of Kentucky before he came to Montana. And my mother's folks came from Kentucky.
They were going out to Seattle to settle, and some of these Montana promoters talked them into staying in White Sulphur. It was such an up-and-coming town that it might even be the capital someday. So, but
my grandfather was in the 1899 session of the legislature that I'm sure some of you have read about. And one day I asked my mother, did you ever get any of that money? And She said if he did, he didn't spend it at home.
Teresa Buckingham wrote about this marriage, Aubrey and Richard. The surprising and innovative programs launched by Richard Ringling kept the valley in a state of with their log houses and pole corrals skeptical of what was to come of all this. The townspeople stood back, but only briefly. No one had to peek over the back fence at the garden party where Richard Ringling was. He was inclusive with his invitations. Easygoing and fun-loving, he had a talent for mixing his eastern friends with his western neighbors, and everyone had fun. His advisors, his help, and his drinking companions came from the local people as much as from the show business and dude ranch circles. With the family's easy relationship with the community, the staff was often stretched to include the townspeople. It was not unusual, for example, to hear Aunt Carrie Zentner is going to Florida with the Ringlings. She used to help with the children on the train. Paul doesn't remember that.
Carrie Zentner?
No, but you didn't remember that they took people to Florida with them on the train.
Well, everybody moved by railroad then.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ringlings are taking Bill Hensley to Sarasota for the winter. They have some work there they want him to do. The local vet worked for them on a full-time basis with the stock and also at large dog kennels. Just about everyone at some time or another worked at the ranches. Most high school boys could brag that they had played pool in the basement recreation room, even though none of the children in the family were then at that age. It was a common sight along a country road to meet the children in their pony cart, loaded with small friends they had picked up along the way. Aubrey, trim and suntanned in ranch clothes, silver Indian jewelry, and custom-made boots, always took time for an unhurried chat with old friends or ranch hands, sunning themselves on the sheepherder side of Main Street. She never forgot a name or a face or a ranch. Her charities were prompted because she knew when people were in need. The house, then they bought a home, or actually John Ringling bought this mansion that one of the early settlers had built, and it's still in white sulfur. I think might be a picture of that over there. The house, now on a truly grand scale, was furnished with massive mahogany, teakwood tapestries, and Tiffany lamps. A large Tiffany lamp hanging over the dining room had a bullet hole in it. There were as many tales about how the bullet hole got there as there were colors.
It wasn't a bullet. It was a champagne cork.
Oh. There you go.
That's even better.
Yeah. The cellar, they say, was stocked on schedule.
Maybe I better go sit down.
No, don't you dare. The cellar was stocked on schedule by bootleggers arriving in 3 big open touring cars. The liquor bottles were not in cases, but individually wrapped in burlap and tied in sacks. And you said you remembered rolling some of those down.
Those guns?
Uh-huh.
Well, in our house, we had a gun room.
Uh-huh.
There were all kinds of guns in it. My dad was a great hunter. And when I was a kid, I was like a bird dog myself. I loved to hunt, fish, and everything. But
Yeah. Big flashy cars move regularly on the dusty Main Street. Everyone looked important, and probably everyone was. They say the poker games were legendary. They say. Everyone had a story embellished according to the creativity of the teller. Aubrey's sister Olga was married in 1915 to John Kirk up in Butte. This marriage was a short one, and a year after Richard and Aubrey married, she married Lester Work of Gallatin County, a wool buyer and sheepman. This marriage ended in divorce in 1919. However, the brothers-in-law, Ringling and Work, went into the ranching business together, buying the Clear Ranch range from John Ringling in 1921 and operating as Ringling and Work. Work was in charge of the sheep. The Ringlings chose Work as Paul's godfather in 1920. However, Ringling and Work ended their relationship in 1922 when Richard bought Work's interest in the operation. After getting established in the sheep business, Ringling moved to other fields. In 1916, John Ringling had established a dairy herd the seed stock of the cattle herd. This is, I mentioned before, that he might use to send cattle to Europe. In 1920 and 21, additional stock was purchased. And they were all purebred stock. Richard had his own stock, and in the early 20s, took his cows to shows, winning more than 150 trophies in a few short years. Managed by J.G. Coleman, the herd boasted winners such as Rose Glen, DeCole Arline, a Montana champion butterfat producer, and Alcarda Johnson, DeCole Burke VI, a champion who kept up her record with milk production, despite the fact that she was exhibited from county fair to county fair. And this is a part of rural Montana that I never heard about, you know, taking your animals to the fairs and having them judged. More than 300 gallons of milk were delivered to the creamery daily, and 100 ranchers were on the weekly payroll for bringing in cream. He built a huge barn for the cows and a creamery, and shipped it all over the country. They claim it was on the, or they don't claim, it was on the
Castle Mountain Gold was
Castle Mountain Gold, and it was
Yes.
on the trains that crossed the country. It was famous butter. Then in 1922, F.A. McDonald and Ringling purchased the Kenyon Ranch at Mule Creek. That was 1,320 acres, and the Shade Place at Hussey Creek of 420 acres. The plan was to turn the ranchers into dairy farms, and the Kenyon Place to run over 75 dairy cows, and the Shade Place about 50. This was an idea that Ringling had to keep his creamery full, but you know, it made good sense for all of them to be involved in this venture. So anyway, he bought the Kenyon Ranch and the Shade Place at Hussey Creek. I mentioned that. Then he bought the Mark Hunt property east of town of 240 acres. The Hunt Ranch was considered an ideal dairy farm. Hussey had a herd of purebred Holsteins that he sold to the Hollywood farms in California. The few that he retained, he sold to Ringling. The barn was said to have modern dairy equipment. Ringling immediately put a crew to repaint the buildings. Anything he was involved with, that he built, bought, or partnered in, he made sure that they were painted and kept up and looked, you know, we're not shabby looking. And then in 1922, he built a new creamery. I have some other material here that we won't go into about the Holsteins. Anyway, they moved the railroad station and put a creamery by the railroad track there in White Sulphur Springs. And the creamery was opened in 1923. So the Civics Club and the Home Ec Department from Bozeman all came to the opening and catered a little luncheon, so that it was a very festive affair. The papers mentioned that Richard Ringling is the owner of one of the largest and best equipped dairy plants west of Mississippi. J.H. Healy is manager of the dairy. We are milking about 460 registered Holstein cows in our plant at White Sulphur Springs and make an average of 100,000 pounds of butter a month. Mr. Ringling plans to have 50 head of show cattle and all the important fairs and shows in the East this fall. He expects to place sentries in Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin at the Minnesota State Fair, and end the season with prize winners of the International Hay and Grain Show at Chicago. He also was quite interested in rodeoing. And in 1919, he went back to New York City and formed a and I don't know the name of it, but it was an association to place or to schedule rodeos and to send scheduled riders and that sort of thing. That was in 1919. It was the same year that a group of men in Bozeman, or out of Bozeman, started the Bozeman Roundup. And in 1922, they approached Ringling to build them a stadium. Well, instead of building the stadium for him, he bought the thing from him and the company from him and built his own stadium. I mean, there was no point in him donating it.
The Bozeman Roundup Association.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that was really one of his pet things in his career, that he enjoyed that a great deal. And it sent, or had, what do you call it, scheduled rodeos clear back in Madison Square Garden in New York. And in 1923, he sent a whole trainload of cowboys and steers to rope and bucking horses and horses back to New York to be to appear in the Madison Square Garden. So he loved, apparently, not only doing things and building things, but it had to be the best. And he had plenty of money to do that. However, the money was sort of running lower on the circus for some reason. 1919, his father died. Am I right there?
Yes, 1919, L.T. Ringling died,
Yeah.
yes.
And so Richard became a third owner of the circus. But he really wasn't a circus person. He apparently didn't like it as well as being a farmer and rancher. So they struggled for a few years because we went into a depression. And a lot of the ventures that Richard had done weren't paying very well. And he got into a scrape with one company. He had a deal with these guys they didn't have enough money to put sheep on their ranch, and so he made a deal with them that he would put the sheep on, and then they'd split had some sort of a deal. And over the next 2 or 3 years, they claimed that Richard was stealing. Well, he wasn't stealing from him. He was taking all the money, and they weren't getting anything. And there was quite a case going on that went on for a number of years. Okay, where am I at, Paul? What's next? I guess they struggled through the Depression, and then in 1931, Richard died. And
36. Oh, 31, and my father was 36. That's
Yeah.
right, 31.
And so it was Aubrey then she inherited a third of the circus, along with the ranching places in Montana. And since it was, the conditions were bad, but she stuck with it, and she even traveled with the circus and took the kids along. And she said in her memoirs, or at some place, that Paul didn't like to go to traveling too much. He'd rather stay home and ride his horse.
That's right, yeah.
And he would go, and he told me this, that he would go for days at a time and not come home.
I had a good friend that lived, I went to the Birch Creek Ranch, I don't know if you know where that is, west of White Sulphur Springs. Well, I have a good friend that lived at a smaller ranch farther west. His last name was Culler, George Culler. And George and I, just kids, rode all over that country. You can't imagine the freedom that we had. We would leave his place and ride to a cow camp out between Ringling and White Sulphur Springs, stay there for a week. Well, there was no telephones. They figured you got there. Well, howdy. God, here's one of my old neighbors sitting here. But anyway, we just had freedom that you just can't believe. I told my mother when I was about 7, I was tired of living in town. She says, fine, you go at the ranch, and that's what I did.
I don't think his mother was put up with much.
No, my mother believed in direct action.
Well, her story is interesting too, as she struggled to make things right economically, and they were still after her for the settlement from the 2 sheep herders or the 2 sheep men, and that case was in the courts for some time. And Paul told me this, that when they issued a summons to go to court, the sheriff would call Aubrey and tell her that he was on his way, so she had time enough to get out and get in the car and go to Ringling and get on the train. So she couldn't be served. So.
My mother was in the probate court, if you can believe it, for 14 years. But Mike Bergen was the sheriff at White Sulphur Springs. And the sheriff, of course, I'm telling you something you already know, but the sheriff is the one that serves the papers. So he'd call my mother and say, I have these things to serve, and she'd get on a train and no one could find her. Mike couldn't find her.
One of Richard's friends and helpers was John Potter, who was one of the young men he'd met when he first came to town. And he studied to be an engineer, I think.
Yeah, Dude Potter.
Yeah, but anyway, he worked with John Ringling. And he would, take charge of going to schedule rodeos and things like that, so that John didn't have to do all of that. He couldn't do it all because one man couldn't be that many places. So anyway, one of the highlights of the rodeoing people was that they supplied the bucking horses for the fight that they had at the Dempsey fight up in, where was that?
Yes.
Yeah. And
Dempsey Gibbons.
yeah. Then in 1926, there was a fire in the stands in Bozeman, and the seating had to be replaced. And Richard decided he probably couldn't afford to at that time, and decided not to keep on with the rodeo. But he enjoyed that. It was a good part of his life. And then he died in 1931, and it fell to Aubrey then to take care of things. And she inherited a third of the Ringling Brothers Circus, and she went with them, rode, and did her bit. Finally, in the 40s, I think it was, she remarried, and she finally decided that there was too much bickering going on in the meetings of the circus, so she sold the circus, her shares in the circus, and then she sold the property in Montana, and she and her husband retired to Florida, I think it was. He was a congressman. Okay, now, what have I forgotten?
Well, do you want me to help you out a little?
Yeah.
Or are we coming to the next spot?
Yeah, well, what do we do, partner?
I'm in the book, I know.
Well, yeah, we got to talk about you.
Okay. Do I get to start now?
Yes.
Okay. I'll help Lee out a little bit.
Yeah.
One time Lee and I weren't too friendly.
Oh,
Is
no.
that correct?
No, never.
But anyway,
We're opposite political sides,
Yeah.
nothing serious.
it wasn't easy to be a Democrat in Marr County. when I graduated from high school, I worked 5 seasons on the circus myself. The first 2 years, I worked in the ticket department. The second 2 years, I worked in the can't just totally explain it to you, but the layout, setting it up, tearing it down, moving it, that was 2 years. And the last year, I checked outdoor advertising. That was 1941. And then I would be about 12 days ahead of the show and check. I don't know if you people, some of you remember how the billing would be for a circus in the stores and billboards and on the walls and the daubs on the barns. And, well, every one of those had an address, and and someone paid or got tickets for putting those sheets up in the stores. Well, then that was my job, was to check. Number one, we were checking our own people to be sure they didn't throw them in a culvert and go to the local bar or something. And then we wanted to be sure they were there. And so I would check a one bill poster into a town, say Helena, and then I would check a different one going out of town. And then in town, I'd check all the stores. There were places that were the bills up in the store. If it wasn't there, then I stopped in to find out why it wasn't there. And if they just pulled them down, then they marked their tickets no good. Well, I was gone by the time they come to go to the show about 10 days or 12 days later. But anyway, I spent 5 seasons on the circus myself, and part of the time in winter quarters. Anymore? 42, I went in the service.
Yeah, and was a very prestigious serviceman, too.
And then 45, I went to school on the GI Bill. And then I was actually going to go back to work on the circus. It would have been the best job I ever had. I mean, money-wise and everything. But my wife, or you ladies here, I married my high school sweetheart. In the 80s, 70-some odd years later, I lost her. But anyway, she couldn't travel with me because Rick is wandering around here somewhere. He was on the way, and she wouldn't be able. And then my family, they were suing each other back and forth in lawsuits. And I said, the heck with it. Well, that wasn't quite heck, but anyway. So I didn't go back. I knew I could do better than. And then the management changed. I was hired. The management changed. The new management rehired me. Then my wife, her name was Althea, we talked it over. And I said, there'll not be another change in management and I'll be out on the road, so I didn't go back.
Just a little bit of note about the railroad, and then I think we might be through. When John Ringling built the railroad, it was over a fairly smooth track, but they seemed to have a lot of problems with it. And they didn't. One thing that was wrong with it, they didn't have enough business to keep it going, and it was 11 miles to Ringling?
No, from White Sulphur Springs to Ringling, it's more like 23.
23, okay. And a lot of times toward the end, they got so bad that when the train pulled out of White Sulphur, the repair crew went along on the highway alongside them to be there when they needed them. But John Ringling had brought some young people from, I've forgotten where, Mississippi or someplace, to work on the railroad, and they managed it very well. And the highlight of the little railroad was when they appeared in the movie, the movie about the pioneer lady who came out to Wyoming. They filmed it around White Sulphur, so That was the big deal for the train.
My Uncle John Brothers kidded him and said his railroad wasn't very long, but it was as wide as anyone's.
Yeah. Well, do we need to tell them any more, or let them? Do we need to tell them any more?
It's up to you, Lee. You're the head
Well, if
head
you-
honcho here.
Well, if you want to tell more stories, we'd like to hear them.
Go ahead.
No, you,
Oh,
yeah.
well, you mean you want to get a little amount of my history?
Well,
My-
your history and
Well,
anybody else's.
My old hometown is White Sulphur Springs, about, most of you, it's about 80 miles east of here. And I lived in White Sulphur Springs. My wife, Althea, was born on a homestead of 16. Do you know where 16 is? East of Ringling, along the Milwaukee, the old Milwaukee. She was born on a homestead there. We were married in 1940. We stopped by at I never had much of a home after my dad died, and Althea never lived with her own family after she was about 6 or 7. So we stopped by, real happy, kids going to get married. Tell her mother we're on our way to get married. Her mother said it's about time. But anyway, it worked. Well, I have. My youngest son, Rock, is sitting here, and my grandson, Rick, is sitting here, and I have a son, Rick, wandering around here somewhere.
He's outside.
Oh, there he is.
Take off your hat. Thank you.
And I spent quite a lot of time in Helena. I was on the board of what then was the PCA, the Montana Livestock. It's no longer a PCA, but was then. Then I was in the legislature from Marr County, if you can believe it. Lee's hometown, I always got 9 votes, but I never was sure which 9 it was. And that's one precinct I never carried.
Yeah, but you came and had lunch with us when you were campaigning.
Oh, yeah, I rang every doorbell about in Marr County, but everybody's polite, and invite you in, even if they were gritting their teeth a little bit.
No gritting.
But I was in the legislature under the old Constitution, not in the new one, but the old one. And so each county, and it's no longer that way, it's more districts, but each county had a senator, and each county had the representative. I had a good friend, a Republican, in the House. I was in the Senate then. And talking a little bit of politics. He was a Republican, me a Democrat, but we were good friends. And the next time it came around, they defeated, his name was Claude Kiff, he lived at Ringling, a great musician, clarinet and saxophone player. He and Miller Smith from here would put on some of the best programs you ever heard. Miller on the piano and Claude Kiff on the clarinet or the saxophone. But anyway, they defeated Claude because they said he was too good a friend to me. But then I was on the interim session. We had 100% batting average. The House killed every bill we recommended. The Republican House, the Senate was still controlled by the Democrats. Hugo was the governor when I first, Hugo Aronson. I really find, I don't know, many of you people knew Hugo. He was a nice person. And he was a Swede, and I talked with a little Swede. One thing he said, I said, about old Hugo, when I fall on my face, I'm 6 feet further ahead. That's the kind of, he was really a great guy. I liked him.
Yeah.
Yes, Jay?
Can I ask you a question? When you were discharged from, or after you graduated from school and decided to leave the circus, did you buy a ranch right after
my mother was having a one day, my mother had a foreman working for her, his name was Ike Mart, and she had a Chevrolet car that she was going to sell me. She was going to sell it to the veteran.
Paul,
Ike wanted the car, and he said, well, if you don't sell me the car, I'm going to quit. And she says, fine, go ahead, quit. And then she asked me if I thought I could run the ranch, and I said, well, I think I can. So from 46 to 49, that fall of 49, I told my mother, when everything is done, everything is ready for winter, I'm leaving. Because whenever I'd go up, you know, I was operating the ranch, buying groceries and all that stuff. I'd go uptown, and here she'd be hobnobbing with a guy she had to can because he was stealing from her. And he'd tell her everything I was doing wrong. The ranch made money every year I was there. But anyway, Jay, then Elsie and I bought part of the ranch. And we paid more for it than she sold for some of the other people.
what do they call that, tough love? Tough love?
Yes, yeah, right.
Did I mention that they lived in the house that, the old house that, very Victorian?
Well, that was our home in White Sulphur
Yeah.
Springs, yes.
And
That was the old Parberry. The name of the people that built the home where we lived was named Parberry at White Sulphur Springs.
Parberry was, excuse me.
And right across the street was Spencer. Gid Spencer was a banker in White Sulphur Springs, had the Central State Bank. You've read about the bank holidays to close the banks all over the country. And Gid had the Central State Bank, and he didn't like the new rules he'd have to operate under. So Gid paid all the depositors, received their money. He took all the bad paper himself and closed the bank. I used to go over and eat breakfast with him. Then we had another neighbor across the street. We never had hotcakes or waffles or stuff at home, so Gid Berg and Dave Berg was a gambler, and he didn't eat breakfast till about 10 in the morning. Mrs. Berg, a Norwegian lady, really had a fine breakfast for him. Well, I'd go over there and visit with him and eat hotcakes and waffles and stuff that I never got at home. It was a great time to be a kid.
Well, did you ever get in trouble for taking off all the time, like for weeks at a time?
Pardon me?
Did you ever get into trouble for being gone so long from your
I
mother?
didn't wind up in jail and all that.
But I mean with your mother, when you took off and you wouldn't come home for days.
Oh, heck, I'm not going to criticize my mother. You only have one mother. My mother hated my sweetheart. I had a high school well, we were married for years, and then I lost her. But anyway, that's one reason I worked on the circus. That's one reason I graduated from high school in Livingston. She wanted to get me away from that girl.
Didn't work. Didn't work.
No.
No, you made a good choice. That she's a lovely lady. Was a lovely lady.
I'm partly colorblind. So when my mother quit buying my shirts, my wife started. My wife said I needed a guardian when I went shopping, and she was right.
Well, any more questions or reminiscences?
Yes.
What was the population of White Sulphur, say, during the early 1920s?
Well, when I started school in the first grade, there were there were 27 of us children in the first grade. And the population of White Sulphur Springs then must have been close to, maybe it was 1,000 or more. And the railroad, actually, Lee, the railroad made money until Milwaukee went out. And of course, that was the end of the railroad.
Yeah.
I'd say about 1,000. And then there were a lot of homes, small ranches and farmers around the area. And then one thing, Lee, I'm going to correct you on one.
Okay.
Lee mentioned that the circus never played Montana, but that's not true. The circus played in Great Falls, Helena,
That's right.
afternoon only in Missoula, because they had to stop and feed and water. You were on your way to the coast, but if the circus went up through Canada, then you come down through Great Falls. If it went up to Denver and north would be Butte, almost every year Helena, then west to Missoula. Everything traveled on the railroad.
I remember reading in the newspaper, not current newspaper, but the old newspapers, in 1924, Charlie Russell went down to see the people and gave the circus people sketches and things to take with them. So,
How many performers and personnel traveled on the train with the circus at that
With
time?
the circus, there would have been about 1,250 people traveling.
I think,
You're talking, that includes the performers, the workers. It took a tremendous crew to put this circus up, take it down. We moved every day.
Paul, can you tell them about the way they had 4 trains?
Yes.
And could you tell them how they came and what their scheduling?
Well, the first train we called the squadron, and that was the squadron, and I rode that 2 years. We would be rolling out of town, and the performance would still be going on. But the squadron carried the layout, the cookhouse. We'd unload in Helena. I got up, our wake-up call was 3:30 in the morning. And then we unloaded everything. Well, say we're here in Helena, the cookhouse would be serving breakfast at 6, and it was a good one. And then Lee mentioned the animals. There was no such thing as not treating an animal well on the circus. They were fed well, they were taken care of. The first 2 years that I worked on the show in 37 and 38, so they moved all the things with teams, with 2, 4, and 6 horse, 8 horse teams. And then the elephants, a lot of the elephants worked, but they were well fed and taken care of. There was no such thing as abusing them on the circus.
Where did they perform in Helena? Where was the performance in Helena?
We had our own tent.
I know, but where did you put the tent?
Oh, gee, I'm trying to.
I thought it was about behind the old armory.
The last time they were in Helena was in about 1952 or 3, and they were down behind the armory.
Yeah, that's what I remember.
Behind the armory, down by the YMCA.
No, that would have been after I was traveling with them. Yes.
How many animals?
How many
How
animals?
many animals?
Oh, gee, there were lions and tigers and elephants and monkeys and bears and animals. If I put a number on them, I know I'm going to be wrong, but I'd say a couple of hundred.
We had a lot of horses.
Pardon me?
You had a lot of horses.
Oh, yes, well, teams of horses. But you were talking, I thought you meant like wild animals and monkeys. And then the elephants, a lot of the elephants worked. An elephant was really a good work animal. And, with a team, they might kind of, but an elephant just kind of moved real slow. And they were great for pulling up the center poles for the big top.
And one other thing we forgot to mention, I forgot to mention, is Taylor Gordon, who traveled with the Ringlings and was worked for the Ringlings. And his is an interesting story, too.
Who was that, Lee?
Did I get it right? The Negro from Taylor Gordon. What did I say?
Oh, Taylor Gordon. Taylor Gordon was raised at White Sulphur Springs.
Right.
Yes.
And he used to drive the car for Ringlings when they come out, and he would go to, when the Ringlings went to show land to these people to buy, and then he traveled with the Ringlings, and he was sort of John's valet, as it were, and he had some interesting experiences to tell about traveling with the circus.
Taylor Gordon was black.
Yeah.
Yes. The Gordon family were black
Called
family.
him Snowball.
Well, anyway. Well, thank you so much, Paul.
Taylor Gordon was about the same age as my mother, and his sister Rose was a little older, but I think Taylor and my mother were about the same age. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Well, again, I apologize for getting my notes all mixed up, but it worked well.